When you release a game, I'd say the most important thing is for it to be good and ready to be released, of course. Otherwise, nobody wants to play it. But what might just be almost as important is finding out a good spot to release your game. If your game is big enough, all the other publishers should find other spots to release their game so they don't compete with the big new game release. And then there are these. Whether they are good or bad, some games just come out at the worst possible time. Maybe they come out on or around the same day of another big release. Maybe like it's a similar release to another game that just came out or is coming out, and there's a lot of overlap. Maybe some games come out on a console that is dying or is already dead. Or maybe there are other circumstances. Whatever the case may be, these are the games that were released at the wrong time. Now, I made a list a few months back about games released on the wrong console, but those games mainly made the list because of the console maybe not selling well, or not being able to run the game, or just being a bad fit demographic-wise. This is different. This is more of a time that the publisher chose to publish the game and it did not work. Without further ado, I sure hope this video is not coming out at the wrong time, so if you will indulge me, let's get into this. Hi guys, CBX here, counting down the top 10 games that released at the wrong time. Now before we get started, you know what to do. Subscribe and hit the bell and leave a comment, or I will catch you off guard.
I wanted to give to you, in the last part of your notes here, the significance spiritually of the number 10 in the Bible.
It's crazy to think that had Marth and Roy not appeared in Super Smash Bros. Melee, Fire Emblem might still be stuck in Japan. Say what you want about the franchise, as I know it's fun to hate on because of how many characters are in Smash, but Fire Emblem has become a flagship franchise for Nintendo. Fire Emblem Thracia, I'm gonna assume? Fire Emblem Thracia 776. What a weird ass name. But the game doesn't get talked about so much, probably because it's a Super Famicom game that never released outside Japan, which is fair enough. But what about the fact that it's a Super Famicom game that was released in 1999? To put that in perspective, that is well after the Nintendo 64 was released. 3 years, in fact. Nobody was even thinking about the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo. That's like if Sony released a game exclusive to the PS3 in 2017. What was Nintendo thinking here? Sonic Superstars is a game that just came out this past October, and I feel like I'm the only one who actually remembers this game or has even played it for that matter. It's a perfectly fine yet ultimately safe and at times honestly frustrating 2D Sonic game that had a heavy reliance on multiplayer, which is pretty cool, but Sega made the ultimate mistake when releasing Sonic Superstars, as if you remember when I said it came out this past October, you might remember that that was the same month as the highly anticipated Super Mario Bros. Wonder. But how close did Sonic release to Mario? A couple of weeks? How about 3 days? Sega got really cocky here, releasing a new 2D Sonic game 3 days before the first brand new 2D Mario game in a very long time. There was not a moment of realization that these audiences overlap, like, a lot. And on top of that, putting Mario Wonder aside, October 2023 was a busy month anyways. In addition to Mario and Sonic, that same week saw the release of the highly anticipated Spider-Man 2, which, while probably not as big of an overlap in audiences as Mario and Sonic, I feel like there is some overlap still here. Why did Sega think they could do this?
So I'm going to be giving this flavor 8.5 out of 10 scoops.
Whatever kind of video game mascot goes in between big video game mascots and indie mascots, or whatever the fuck I just said, I think Shante falls under that category. She has become a mascot of sorts for indie games, to the point where the Shante series seems to be more of like a AAA IP, which I'm not going to explain what that is, go look it up. However, back when the first installment came out, it flew under the radar big time. And that's because, while Way Forward had a rather smooth time developing the game, you know, I wrote that, but they didn't have the smoothest time developing the game, but Capcom, the publisher, just sat on the game for months till the Game Boy Advance had already released, and the problem was that Shante was a Game Boy Color game. I don't think I need to explain this one, you know, like the flaw in that. The GBA was this fresh new system and everyone wanted to play that. You know, it's unfortunate because for a handheld game, Shante is very impressive on a technical aspect, but it was worth it in the end, as the game, and by extension the Shante franchise, got a second life after a re-release on the 3DS, and then many new sequels. So at least this one has a happy ending.
36.
Very close, but that's not it. Let's go to Gary the Retard. What number between 2 and 4?
7.
Horizon has become one of Sony's flagship franchises, with Aloy becoming a mascot for the company. In fact, I think Horizon, I think I heard somewhere, and I didn't fact check this, probably should have done that, but I think Horizon is Sony's best-selling franchise that isn't rated M. But that's a little shocking, as when you look at the releases of both games, I'd say that Horizon is unlucky more than anything else. Horizon Zero Dawn was this big new open world IP for Sony, but it was released on February 28th, 2017. On March 3rd, 2017, 3 days later, the much highly anticipated Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was released alongside the Nintendo Switch console. And just like Horizon, Breath of the Wild happened to be a big new open world game, and because of the Zelda name, it overshadowed Horizon. Although to be fair, one was a Switch exclusive and the other was a PlayStation exclusive, and one of those consoles had just came out and was very hard to get. But then 5 years later, the Horizon sequel, Horizon Forbidden West, which had a lot of hype behind it, released on February 18th, 2022. And then the very next week, on February 25th, 2022, the much highly anticipated Elden Ring released, often being compared to Breath of the Wild for taking a series or style of game and revolutionizing it into an open world. Sure, the releases of Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring respectively didn't seem to affect Horizon that much in the long run, but whenever a new Horizon game would release, the conversation was always dominated by something else, which I think says a lot.
Okay, Mrs. Puff, what's my final score?
6.
Woo! Remember that Mad Max game that came out in 2015? To me, it was always a game that exists, and I knew in the back of my mind that it exists, but I never remembered it till I played it once, and it's actually really good. But me forgetting it exists probably echoes a lot of you guys because it's often forgotten, and one factor is the timing of its release. The Mad Max game came out the same year as Mad Max Fury Road, despite being in development for a while and originally planned for a 2014 release. However, the game ended up coming months after the release of Fury Road, which put it in a weird spot as it was too late to be considered a movie tie-in, but a little too soon to be considered its own thing, even if it was meant to be its own thing. But even if that's not enough, Mad Max had some steep competition as it was released in the same month as the highly anticipated Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain. Sure, it's allowed to release in the same month, but it didn't just release in the same month. It released on the same day. And the two games, I'd say, have a lot of overlap in audience and have a lot of similarities with being big open world sandbox games. Simply put, 2015's Mad Max game has to be one of the most cursed games ever made.
Oh, chills. Literal chills.
It was number 5. Number 5 killed my brother.
Oh my god, I forgot about that.
A game that I hear about existing a lot, but I don't really know anyone who has played it, is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. The game, I feel, has a cult following, but the release did not help the game at all. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which is a weird name to say. I don't know, there's something weird about that name, but it was released on November 16th, 2004. On the surface, that doesn't sound too bad. You know how this list is. So what came out close to that? Well, you look at the games that came out the same month, and you'll find Half-Life 2, Halo 2, and Metal Gear Solid 3. All three games were hugely anticipated, and each of them ended up being hailed as some of the greatest games of all time. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines ended up getting pushed out to compete with those games, but because of that, it was pushed out before it was ready, as the game was met with a slew of bugs and glitches. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines was a game that was rushed and pushed out before it was ready to compete with huge games that it stood no shot against. And unfortunately, that kind of happens with a lot of games now. If you are releasing a brand new RPG, it may be best to pick literally any time other than when a brand new mainline Final Fantasy game comes out. Tell that to publisher Aruse, or Aruse, I don't know, who released Shadow Hearts on December 12th, 2001, 5 days before the much highly anticipated Final Fantasy X. That's a recipe for disaster. Sure, Shadow Hearts has its fans, as it was a very technically impressive game for its time with its visuals and combat system, but releasing it just before Final Fantasy X completely overshadowed Shadow Hearts, and it stood no chance. Final Fantasy X had so much hype behind it, being a huge leap for the franchise, so a game that's the first of its franchise was dead on arrival, and the publisher doesn't even really exist anymore. Sad. A lot of these games on the list release at around the same time as a direct competition, which is what ends up, fucking it over big time. But what about a game that releases in between a competitor and itself? By itself, I mean another game that the same publisher published and attracts the same audience. That's what happened with Titanfall 2. Titanfall 2 is the much improved sequel to Titanfall, making a multiplayer first-person shooter out of mechs. It's pretty cool. The problem is that EA released it in between their own Battlefield 1 and Activision's Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. That means EA sent this game to compete with themselves and a competitor. And it's not just any two games it's competing with, it's the two kings of the genre, at least at the time. And let's also not forget that while it had a lot of potential that was then realized in the sequel, the first Titanfall was not received all that well. So you had an IP that still had to prove itself, and you sandwich it between the two worst possible games to sandwich it in between. And let's not forget, one of those games is another game published by EA. Another shooter. It baffles me that they released Titanfall 2 in between not only Call of Duty, but Battlefield as well. I can't think of any other company that chose to compete with a competitor and themselves at the same time.
What kind of pencil do we take again?
Number 2. Take a number 2.
Looks like you took a big number 2.
This next game is a little different, as unlike all the other games on this list, including the upcoming number 1, this poor timing was unavoidable. Socom was a well-beloved multiplayer shooter game on the PlayStation consoles. But then the fourth game, Socom 4 US Navy SEALs, released on April 19th, 2011. Not really competing with any new games, at least none that were direct competition, but the next day was the infamous PSN hack. This had many people's credit card information compromised, which is already bad enough, but in the case of Socom 4 specifically, the online servers for PSN were down, meaning a game like Socom 4, which heavily, if not entirely, relied on online multiplayer, if the PSN servers are down, the game is unplayable. Socom 4 US Navy SEALs, on its launch day, had a pretty decent launch, but because it became unplayable, the game immediately dropped in players, and by the time the PSN got back up and running, people had already forgotten about Socom 4, leading the servers to shut down, the developer Zipper Interactive to close its doors, and the Socom series has not seen a new entry since. Again, it's a set of circumstances that is unlike anything else on this list, making Socom 4 US Navy SEALs probably the most unlucky game of all the games on this list.
I'm a Luigi, number 1.
I know we're all kind of sick of hero shooters now, but let's go back to 2016. Say what you want about Overwatch, cause it sucks donkey dick right now. But back in 2016, Overwatch blew up because there was truly nothing else quite like it. Making a multiplayer shooter with a diverse cast of characters and giving each character their own backstory but no overarching narrative and whatnot wasn't too common. But 3 weeks before Overwatch, on May 3rd, my birthday, Gearbox released Battleborn. Sure, Battleborn came out first, but Gearbox was competing with Blizzard with an online game. And again, Blizzard sucks now, but this was before they sucked. And they were the team behind games like World of Warcraft, Diablo, and StarCraft, making any new Blizzard release an event. Not to mention, In the places where Battleborn was perfectly fine, Overwatch excelled. So after Overwatch launched, servers for Battleborn were a ghost town. This led to the Battleborn servers to shut down after nobody played it for years. Trying to compete with Blizzard's new Overwatch was an absolutely boneheaded move, and that's why Battleborn is the #1 game that launched at the wrong time. So that was this list. What do you guys think? Did I leave out any games that came out at the wrong time? I know there's quite a few that I left out. Be sure to come subscribe, or I will catch you off guard.